This evening's lecture connects closely to our current exhibition, To Understanding Through Understanding by Betsy Rosenwald, our fourth artist in residence here at the Ukrainian Museum of Canada. Betsy's work explores memory, identity, and the hidden connections that shape who we are, including the layered and sometimes fraught histories between Jewish and Ukrainian communities. So before we formally introduce our speaker, Betsy would like to share a few words about how this lecture relates to her exhibition. After that, it will be my honor to introduce Dr. Himka.
Okay. Thanks, Jen. Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Dr. Himka. I'm so excited that he's here tonight to speak because he's been a great inspiration to me in conjunction with my exhibition, To Understanding Through Understanding. At the beginning of my residency here at the museum, I felt great uncertainty. What did I know about Ukrainian art or history, or even my own Ukrainian Jewish heritage? Not much. As I delved more deeply, I was even less certain of what I thought I knew, mostly the assumptions I grew up with. I hoped that the residency would give me the opportunity to explore my feelings about what was happening in the world and my own identity in relation to it, and that the work I produced might allow conversations to happen in the safe space of the museum. Dr. Himka's book, Ukrainians, Jews, and the Holocaust, Divergent Memories, examines how and why two communities remember the same traumatic events so differently. It is possible, he says, that the correct path is to understand why memories are divergent and to prepare the way for a shared, if very painful, and painfully acquired narrative, in effect, a new memory. In this time of polarization and deep mistrust, with seemingly never-ending conflicts raging around the world, dialogue across and through differences is perhaps the best hope we have. Thank you.
I'd just say one of the things that I love about our Artist in Residence program is that it precisely brings new conversations to our museum that our staff would not be bringing forward all by ourselves. And so this has been just such a great honor, Betsy, to work with you on this. And it is now a profound honor to welcome Professor John Paul Himka to Saskatoon. Dr. Himka is Professor Emeritus in the Department of History and Classics at the University of Alberta, and he is widely regarded as one of the most influential historians of Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora working today. Over a career spanning more than 4 decades, he has shaped how scholars and communities understand Ukrainian nationalism, religion, memory, and Ukrainian Jewish relations. He is known not only for his scholarship, but for his intellectual courage. Dr. Himka has consistently asked difficult questions about the past, challenged simplified narratives, and insisted that historical integrity matters, even when it is uncomfortable. His work on memory, the Holocaust in Ukraine, and the politics of commemoration has been internationally recognized and widely debated. Tonight's lecture, 5 Sins and 5 Mitzvot, invites us to consider not only past events, but present responsibility. Rather than focusing solely on historical deeds, Dr. Himka asks us to reflect on the perceptions and mental images that continue to shape Ukrainian-Jewish relations. Today, what harms those relationships and what actions, what mitzvot, might help repair and strengthen them. Ukraine, for those of you who may not know, probably most of you do now, Ukraine has always been a diverse society. Jewish and Ukrainian communities have lived alongside each other for centuries. That proximity has created moments of cultural exchange, creativity, and solidarity, as well as painful chapters. Our task today is not to simplify that history, but to understand it, and to engage one another with honesty and respect. We are grateful to Dr. Himka for being here tonight and for modeling what rigorous principled scholarship looks like in public life. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. John Paul Himka.
There are differences between young and old, male and female, political differences within the Jewish and both within the Jewish and Ukrainian nations. Both of those nations had Bolsheviks. Both of those nations had liberals. Both of those nations have had and continue to have extreme nationalists. There's been divisions of orientation in these two groups. So Ukrainians also had Russophiles who felt that Ukrainians were a branch of the Russian nation. They were very strong in the Galicia region in the 1860s and 1870s, and they were also very strong in Russian Ukraine, the Russian Empire. There were also so-called Gente Ruteni, Nazione Poloni, that is, Ukrainians who believed that, yes, they were Ukrainian by birth, but politically they were Poles. And, of course, a large number of Ukrainian gentry Polonized in the course of the early modern period. So there's quite a diversity there. And the same is true of Jews. Some are oriented toward Yiddish. For instance, the Bund is a good example of that. Others toward Hebrew, Zionism, and others towards assimilation to German, Polish, or Russian culture. Here's an example of essentialism that goes really bad. The outbursts of anti-Semitism today because of what's going on in Israel and Gaza. Not all Jews support this. I think, I know most of the Jews I personally know, of course we live in a certain kind of community. They don't like the war, and they don't like the killing that's going on, and so you can't just identify somebody with a view. That's essentialism. Every population group has criminals and saints and every shade of morality in between. One cannot speak of the Jews or the Ukrainians. As the Jewish Forward once put it, which is, by the way, a sort of Bundist leftover that still is published, as the Jewish Forward once put it, it's all right to say Jews dominate Hollywood, but it's anti-Semitic to say that the Jews dominate Hollywood. Anti-Semites have often imagined the Jews as the puppet masters of both capitalism and communism, and whatever alleged evil one Jew or some Jews committed was chalked up to the entire Jewish nation. Daniel Mendelsohn in The Lost, by the way, that's a very good book, and if you go into the exhibition that Betsy has of her art, you'll see some books lying there, and one of them is The Lost by Daniel Mendelsohn. Anyways, Daniel Mendelsohn in The Lost points out how frequently Holocaust survivors would say the Ukrainians were the worst. But in almost every case, these Jewish survivors only managed to survive because they were helped by Ukrainians. And incidentally, this whole book is full of extended meditations on the Ukrainian-Jewish relationship, often with reference to the biblical narrative of the two brothers, Cain and Abel. So, essentialism, I think, is the first sin. We should always avoid this. The second sin, closely related in some respects, is stereotypes and prejudices. So, in the book by Mendelsohn, he points out this odd thing, that the Ukrainians were the worst in the minds of these survivors, but all of them had been helped by Ukrainians one way or another. Well, what happens here, and this is an example of the dangers of stereotypes, because I'm talking about stereotypes and prejudices, is that there were Ukrainians who were persecuting the Jews during the Holocaust. And that would have been the forces of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. They had a Ukrainian National Militia, which was involved in the pogroms of 1941, summer of 1941. And they had the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which hunted down Jews and killed them after the liquidation of the ghettos in 1943. There was the Ukrainian police, which was one of the major instruments of the murder of the Jews in Ukraine. There were Ukrainian administrations that worked closely with the Germans. And there were local perpetrators. All these people, it's difficult to judge them because of the situation they were in, of very, very difficult situations in World War II. I often try to figure out myself what would I have done in World War II. So how is it that on the one hand there were these Ukrainians, but the people who are saved by Ukrainians can't see it, and that's because they don't refer to them as Ukrainians. They refer to them as their peasants, or their friends, or their former employees. But it's very clear who they are. They're Ukrainians. But when we think in stereotypes, when we ascribe these kind of characteristics to a nation or to a group, it's terrible. And that's how stereotypes work, is that they work through confirmation bias. So you may see somebody who does something that fits the stereotype, and that's it. Like, for instance, I worked in a factory as a young man. And one of my favorite guys was this guy, Duke. He was a black American. And he was the laziest person I ever saw in my life. We would work together. He would go to sleep. We worked the night shift. He would go to sleep, and then when the boss would come, he and also me and my friend would sweep up the factory floor just before we had to leave to show that But the fact is, the matter is, this was an individual who was lazy. But so was my hillbilly friend, and so was I, by comparison. And but on his case, it might stick, if you understand what I'm saying. And similarly, if somebody gets cheated in a store or in a restaurant, they'll say, oh, but if it was, if the owner was clearly Jewish, they might say, oh, that Jew cheated me. All these things are extremely dangerous. This kind of seeing people through these generalizations that don't bear scrutiny. I think that happens, and we see it a lot when anti-Semitic texts were being published in Ukraine in the 1930s. They had all these stereotypes. Jews cheat, they do this, they do that. So I put that number, stereotypes and prejudices, as my number 2. More complex, though, is number 3, which is competitive, invidious victimhood. So that what I have in mind here is when Jews and Ukrainians sometimes try to outdo each other in how much they suffered. So I've read actually several accounts of Ukrainians who said, oh, the Holodomor was much worse than the Holocaust because we were starved to death. I mean, total ignorance. The Jews in the ghetto died mostly of malnutrition and diseases associated with malnutrition. They weren't just rounded up immediately and poisoned with gas or with a shot. So that kind of thing. The numbers game. It was a Ukrainian politician who had a toast. He said, "Here are to the 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust, and to the 7 to 10 million Ukrainians who died in the Holodomor." That kind of thinking helps nobody. It builds terrible bridges. I think, as a scholar of these kind of terrible things, I see the need for scholarly comparisons, because that's how we find out about how mass murders work and mass killings work. But, you don't want to be on a competition to show who's on top of the victim list. That's hurts our relations. I have a was a professor, I took a class from in summer school. I really like him, Stephen Katz, Jewish. But much of his work on all his life has been to compare the Holocaust with all other terrible things, and always finding that the Holocaust is the only true genocide that ever occurred. Even the massacre and destruction of the native populations of North America, he says nothing like the Holocaust. What does he prove by this? People suffer, children die. Lots of people suffer. This is not the way. We do not want to compete to be at the top of the heap. Who's history's greatest losers? You or me? No, that's not a good way to proceed. And closely related to that is number 4, which is what I call the instrumentalization of our tragedies. When we use our tragedies, for the Jews it's the Holocaust, for Ukrainians it's mainly the Holodomor, but there could be a lot more other tragedies that both groups have suffered over the years. To me, when you instrumentalize, by which I mean you use these tragedies to make a current political or cultural point, I think that is very wrong. First of all, I still have this kind of early human morality about the dead, that the dead are sacred. And you have millions of dead, their memory is sacred. They are sacred. Don't use them for politics. So the Holodomor has been used for an anti-Russian animus in Ukraine, also for anti-Jewish, because Ukrainian anti-Semites, quite a few of them, have blamed the Jews for the Holodomor, which is complete nonsense. If you need to know why, I can explain that too. And the Holodomor, they consider these people to be martyrs for Ukrainian nationalism. And in case of Jews, the Holocaust as a justification of the state of Israel. I mean, I understand to a certain extent that's true, of course, that Europe was proving a terrible home for the Jews. But it really doesn't fit quite so closely as is often thought. First of all, these were victims. They weren't martyrs. They didn't die for Ukraine, or Israel, for a state. They were victims. They were of every age group, every sex, sexual orientation, political orientation, whatever. They did not die for a cause. Oh, no, I mean, they did. I thought I had a misprint here. They did die for a cause, but not for Ukrainian nationalism or Zionism, but for the causes embraced by the Stalinists and Hitlerites. That is, they did not die because they wanted the establishment of a Ukrainian or Jewish state. They died because murderous dictators wanted them dead. 5. Okay, 5 is I'm guilty of false advertising. When I originally made this title, I thought I had 5 things, but I didn't want to go scrambling around for garbage. These, to me, are the major things. The major things: essentialism, stereotypes and prejudices, competitive victimhood, instrumentalization of our tragedies. To me, those are the most poisonous elements in the Ukrainian-Jewish relationship. So I was guilty of false advertising. The 5 mitzvot, that is the 5 kind of good deeds we can do to, I suppose to really enrich ourselves, is the first one, I would say, is reconstituting the history of Ukraine from a territorial instead of ethno-nationalist perspective. By which I mean, you look at Ukraine, and all the people in it are the subjects of Ukrainian history. Whether they're Jewish, whether they're Tatar, whatever. We have to have an integrated history, which has everybody. Now, it's Ukrainian history developed as an ethno-nationalist perspective because these were people who were neglected in the existing historiographies. Most Ukrainians in the 19th century, when history was being written, were serfs or peasants until 1848 in Galicia, until 1861-64 in the Russian Empire. And so when Hrushevsky, our greatest historian, started writing a history of Ukraine, he concentrated on the Ukrainians. If the Tatars appeared, they were raiding. Jews were merchants. But he wrote a history of our people. And it made sense at a time when we were completely invisible. Well, or when Ukrainians were completely invisible. I kind of identify with Ukrainians. And we have to get beyond that. We have to begin to look more broadly at what Ukraine really was and is. Mind you, much of the old diversity is gone. Most of the Jews who lived there were murdered. Most of the Tatars who lived there were displaced. The Germans were all moved out. The Poles were all moved out. So the only diversity we have is about a 20% Russian minority. Maybe less than that. Anyways, but there are people who have been working on this, on building a more territorial viewpoint of our history. So Professor Paul R. Maguchi, or Bob Maguchi as we used to call him, because he's a friend, is just retiring now from the University of Toronto after years of being the chair of the Ukrainian Center there. And he's prolific. He's the best place to go when you want to look up a fact in his books. And he wrote a history of Ukraine which was territorial. Everybody who lived in Ukraine, their history was there. Not so good at able to integrate it yet. But at least by bringing all the players in, he was able to reshape our thinking about Ukraine. And more recently, just a couple years ago, Serhiy Bilenki wrote The Laboratory of Modernity, Ukraine Between Empire and Nation, 1772 to 1914. I was on a jury that to judge that and a number of other books that had come out in Ukrainian studies. I couldn't give first place to him because of another work, but we gave him an honorable mention because it was such an astounding work which really began to actually not only include but to understand the relations and the interrelations of all these people. And this is what we have to do. I'm too old to start it, but I can see it. What we do when we don't, what we lose when we don't do it. We erase so many brilliant people from Ukrainian history because of their non-Ukrainian ethnicity. Not just Jews, but Russians and Poles and others. So I'll give you a few examples of people we've lost. So the major theoretician of American abstract impressionism was a fellow named John D. Graham. In reality, he is not a Graham at all. His real name was Ivan Dombrowski. And he was a descendant of the Polish Szlachta, lived in Kiev, and joined the Russian cavalry. He doesn't count for us at all. Even though when he was still in Ukraine, he organized shows for people like David Burlyuk, a really important Ukrainian artist, modernist, avant-gardist. But we lose him because, well, he's not really part of it. He should be. He should be. even though his most famous things are in the diaspora. And similarly, I have another one as an example, and this shows other people are thinking along my lines. Probably none of you have heard of Sophie Tucker, but I grew up in America, and I'm old. She was known as the last of the Red Hot Mamas, and she was an entertainer of the first class. So when I looked her up today in Wikipedia, she was called a Ukrainian American actress. And of course she's Jewish. Again, somebody we never claim. Because, well, not our ethnicity. But these people come out of exactly the same environment, and I'll come to that. There's a lot in common. So I think that would be the biggest one, and it's probably for the next generation to do. And events like this, where we're incorporating, where we're dialoguing, are good preparation for this need to rethink what is Ukraine, what is Ukrainian history, who are we? That's very important, I think. Okay, number 2, another mitzvah, is admitting to one's own nation's sins. So Ukraine's first president, Leonid Kravchuk, got a lot of flack for what he said in October 1991 at a large open-air ceremony on the territory of Babin Yar, the graveyard of so many Jews. But he said it. This is a unique and suitable moment to ask forgiveness from the Jewish people against whom so many injustices were inflicted during our history. It is difficult, but it is necessary that the people admit errors and request forgiveness. Without this, progress is impossible. I don't 100% agree with this. I agree with the sentiment that he did, but I don't believe people in the present can in any way forgive what was done in the past, or unless they are perpetrating the very same myths that led to mass killings, I don't think that anybody here is responsible for all the tragedies that occurred between our two peoples of one kind of trying to become one people. So maybe we can't forgive, maybe we live a different way, but I do think that when we look at our histories, we have to deal with realities that are, even if they're inconvenient. So, what are Ukraine's sins from the Jewish perspective? Ukrainian sins from the Jewish perspective. Well, good example is Bohdan Khmelnytsky. Bohdan Khmelnytsky, Cossack chieftain, who is one of the most important figures in Eastern Europe. People often don't know it, but when he started his rebellion in 1648, the whole power balance in Eastern Europe shifted. Until Khmelnytsky, Poland was the dominant power throughout Eastern Europe. After the Cossack rebellion of 1648, Russia moved and became the largest power in Eastern Europe. But in the course of this momentous change, and he's a hero to many Ukrainians, although he made a treaty with Muscovy, which other Ukrainians don't like. But in the course of this, he and his Cossacks killed most of the Jews, the tens of thousands, in the area where they were working. So, let's not hide it. It happened. Petlura, Simon Petlura, leader of the Ukrainian People's Republic. He himself was not an anti-Semite. He was a democratic, a liberal man, but he could not control his forces. And in 1919, they killed about 50,000 Jews in the area of Podillia and elsewhere. It's a little complicated because he didn't really have the money or funds to hire the army, even though very often the soldiers would only appear on payday, according to some of his own officials. But you know, I just recently read Weidinger's book about the pogroms of 1919. You could if you got a good Jewish grocery store, you could feed whole army units for a long time. So some of this was economics, some of this was because the Jews are communists, some of this was because the Jews exploit us. Whatever the reasons, you don't kill 50,000 people for no reason. I mean, you do for no reason, but I mean, it's wrong, is what I'm trying to say. And then our Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, it was involved in terrible atrocities during the Holocaust. They are today the heroes of Ukraine. I don't think they should be because of what they did. Other people think differently. Jews' sins, economic exploitation of the peasants. Well, that's true. There was the case of, say, in early modern Ukraine, Jews were often the factors working for the gentry. The gentry didn't want to, and the nobles, they didn't really want to deal with all this stuff. They would hire Jews to manage their estates, and the Jews had to get as much out of the peasants as they could. It was, it's definitely exploitation. And then from the 1860s on, in Galicia, there was a mass movement of many Jews were getting peasants into debt, either through the tavern, getting people to chalk up a bill, or through money lending at a time when our people, that's the Ukrainian people, Ukrainian people were not very numerate. They had not much of a school system at that time. And the idea of having interest of 1% a week sounded really good to the Ukrainians. That's 52%. So Jews would lend out the money, and people would lose land. But I should also point out, just because I'm a historian, I like to point this out, but also Ukrainian priests and others were involved in this same kind of usury to take over land. But that was something that Ukrainian anti-Semites constantly pointed to. So many people lost their livelihoods, and when the Jews were expropriated in Galicia during the Nazi occupation, their businesses, their assets were expropriated right at the beginning of the Holocaust. What they had, because the Soviets first expropriated most of what they had in 1939. The Ukrainian Central Committee, which was led by Volodymyr Kubiovich, said that everything that was confiscated from the Jews should be given to the Ukrainians, because all the Jews' wealth came from what they stole from the Ukrainians. So these are things, obviously, which we have to research, we have to think, we have to see why they did what they did, and I can understand why people acted as they did, but you have to admit it. Then there's the presence in Soviet organs of repression, of Jews in Soviet organs of repression. They were disproportionate in the Soviet organs of repression at certain times. But of course, not all Jews were in the organs of repression, like the NKVD or the KGB or those kind of places. But there were two times when there was an influx of Jews into the organs of repression. One was in the early 1920s, and that was a direct result of the pogroms, of the Pedlura pogroms of 1919. They went in, they wanted to go to the Soviets, they wanted safety, and they wanted to get revenge on the people who killed their grandfathers and their wives. So they really swelled the ranks in the 1920s, in the early 1920s. And then there was also a massive influx of Jews into the organs of repression for several years following World War II. And that was a direct result of the collaboration of the Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian administration, etc., in the Holocaust. So you can read memoirs of Jews survivors, and some of them are so angry at the Ukrainians. They say that we just need to really do as much harm to them as we can. Well, we have to look at all this stuff. We have to understand it. We have to understand why people do what they do. And maybe we can't forgive them, but we can understand them. And I think, the whole idea of this understanding towards reconciliation is important. So that was number 2. That was the admitting to our own nation's sins. Number 3 is remembering rescue. And here I would just say that in regard to the Holocaust, very important is the Yad Vashem initiative, Righteous Among the Nations, where people who, Ukrainians and others, who saved Jews during the Holocaust are commemorated. And the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum also has Righteous. Sometimes they put in people like the Ukrainian Archbishop Metropolitan Sheptytsky, who Yad Vashem will not put in because they're still mad at the Ukrainians from the Holocaust. Thinking very much, I think, in the kind of stereotypic and essentialist terms that I'm decrying here. And not much work has been done, but recently there was a young woman, Raisa Ostapenko, who did a dissertation at the Sorbonne on rescues, a big one, like 600 or 700 pages. And just full of stuff. For me, it was, having worked on the Holocaust for years and years before her, I just learned an awful lot of new stuff. So we have to remember this. And there were also, if you read some of the Holodomor survivors, some of them were saved by Jews. They were warned by Jews when the NKVD was coming. So we have to remember that all this was also going on. Because people sometimes just don't like to see other people hurt. Number 4, contextualization. We always have to understand the context in which things occur. For instance, I've heard Jews say to me, "Why didn't the Ukrainians save more? In France, this would never have happened, but it happened in Ukraine." Well, the France did not have the same kind of Nazi occupation policies that Ukraine had. It's very different. In the East, the Nazis were, they were brutal beasts to begin with. But in the East, the Ost, which they wanted to eliminate the whole population if they could, they were really, really bad. So it was very difficult to save anybody. And what's really strikes me most is there were 2 major rescue operations in, I look at Galicia, Western Ukraine, because I know it best. 2 of them. One was led by this Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky and his brother, Clemente Sheptytsky. The Gestapo would regularly come to the monasteries looking for the Jews that were hiding. And they had a vast network of people so that the Jews could be moved from the monastery to the convent to a certain parish. They had it all organized. They had huge resources. They had money. They were an organization. They had a command structure where the Metropolitan and his brother, who was the head of the Studite monastic order, they could do a lot. With all their resources, they could only save 200 Jews. That's how hard it was. The other major site of rescue was the Roman Catholic convents, nuns. And they probably, I don't have the exact statistics, but it's roughly the same. They were able, with all their, because convents were linked with one another by various, because they belonged to the same order or what, they could only save about 200. For an individual trying to save Jews, and there were so many individuals who did, so difficult. Neighbors, one of the things that rescuers often had in common is that they lived at the edge of the village, so that people wouldn't see them, because you never knew who in the village would sell you out in order to get a bottle of vodka or something from the Germans. And it was dangerous to buy food. If you're buying food and you're a family of like 2, and you're buying like for 8, immediately people would follow you, and there were people who would try to blackmail you, or more likely blackmail the Jews, try to get their whatever jewelry or money that they had. So you have to look at the context. So that's why I like history, because I get some idea of the context for these terrible things that go on. Or, there's been quite a kerfuffle here in Canada about the Ukrainians in Waffen-SS Galicia. They were involved. They were probably involved, most likely involved in the roundup of the Jews in Brody just before the Battle of Brody. They were involved with the destruction of several villages. They were involved in the suppression of the Slovak uprising, which had a lot of Jews in it. So at the end of the Slovak uprising, there were 20,000 of the rebels were left over. 10,000 of them were Slovaks, and they were put into camps. And 10,000 of them were Jews, and they were immediately executed after it. So but what people don't realize is that anybody in the German unit had this same problem. No matter what you did, there was no German units that wasn't involved in the Holocaust. And in Germany, the people who shot Jews, the Einsatzgruppen, only the leaders went to jail. The ordinary shooters were left off. And many of the people who were involved in the Holocaust, after the war in Germany, became pastors, or they became professors. And there were so many perpetrators in Germany, and in any place Germany went, that they just couldn't arrest them all, they couldn't charge them all, they couldn't punish them all. And that's the same true of the Waffen-SS Galicians. So, I understand that, Ukrainians shouldn't be pretending that they were innocent. But on the other hand, this was what World War II was like. It was terrible, and everybody who was there, you had to kind of declare yourself, and there was you think we're polarized now. Well, imagine if that polarization is between the Nazis and the Stalinists. And the pro-communist views of some Jews, I've already explained to a certain extent why they went into the NKVD and so forth. But here in North America, there were also Jews, but often motivated towards communism by their progressive ideals. They had suffered anti-Semitism. They didn't like to see the discrimination against the African-American population. And so they also were often close to the communists and therefore taking the Soviet line. So, yeah, most things people do, there's a context for it. Maybe individual actions are much more difficult. But social, historical moments, they have a context. And my fifth mitzvah is that we should relearn each other's cultures. We once knew each other very well. My grandmother was a lamplighter. She would go to the Jewish homes on Sabbath in the village she lived in, Clifton, and knew all the families very well. Played with their kids. And she used to tell me, as a boy, she told me the names of her kids, the kids she played with when she was a little girl. Actually, a little bit older girl. And one of them was named Shmulko. I thought it was the funniest name I'd ever heard. Shmulko. But it's a Shmuel, Solomon really, is a Jewish name, you know. So she knew them very well. Lots of Ukrainians knew Yiddish. And almost all the Jews in this area spoke Ukrainian. So they used to know each other quite well. In fact, they knew each other so well that during the Holocaust, at the beginning of the Holocaust in Ukraine, the Nazis relied on Ukrainians, like not necessarily crazy Nazi Ukrainians, just educated leadership Ukrainians, to pick out who should be on the Judenrat, and where to put the ghetto. Because they were the ones because they were so intimate at the time. Sometimes intimacy doesn't work. And a friend of ours, Valerie Shatska, her husband's village, the lamplighter, like my grandmother, actually turned him into the Germans. So it can work both ways. But people knew each other. And we should really make an effort. So, literature. If you read Gogol's Ukrainian tales, Mikolo, as we sometimes call them, it's got humor and it has an occasional anti-Semitic quip, but it also has humor and kind of a fantastic Ukrainian mythology. And it's interesting to read him together with Sholem Aleichem. It's clearly the same place they're talking about. There's some, and each nation appears in the other's stories. And there's so many Jewish authors, I'm not even going to bother to mention them. But among the Ukrainian authors of current, my favorite is Andrei Kurkov. And I see that in the bookstore here they have good taste. They have an Andrei Kurkov novel, which I haven't read yet, and probably will. There's an example. Music. Have you ever listened to klezmer music and heard the hopak? That's a Ukrainian dance. Klezmer music, very close to Ukrainian music. When Christy and I were in Lviv, some years ago, maybe 10 years ago, we went to a concert of klezmer music in Lviv. Wonderful, wonderful. Explore each other's music. And then there's the question of cuisine. We have so much in common. Borscht, latkes, otherwise known as potato pancakes. And Chris's mother, every Sviat Večer, that's the evening before Christmas, she would always make farshirovanna riba, which was known as gefilte fish in other language. So, there's a lot there. We have Ukrainian cookbooks, we have Jewish cookbooks. Play with them. One thing some Ukrainians say about Jewish food is that it's sweeter than our Ukrainian food. Well, not long ago, I was invited to Poland to speak, and I went to the Poland Museum, which is a fantastic museum of Jewish history and culture. They had a special exhibit on Jewish cuisine through the ages and all over where they were. And it turns out that, yes, Jewish food in Ukraine tended to be sweeter than it was elsewhere. And the reason for that is that the Jews were heavily invested, did I just say the Jews? Jews were heavily invested in the sugar industry in Ukraine. And so with that investment, they could bring home sugar and other things, and it became part of their cooking. So I wanted to end on a sweet note. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to entertain questions. But quickly, before the questions, I just want to say, I put out this selected resources on Ukrainian Jewish relations. So there's this excellent book by Professor Margochi and Professor Petrovsky-Stern, Jews and Ukrainians, A Millennium of Coexistence. I see that it's for sale in your bookstore. I don't see Sadi Belenki's History Laboratory of Modernity, but I advise you all to read it. If you want to see the lost, it's laying in Betsy's show. And then there's the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, which really tries to deal with all these issues. And now it just put out an ebook, or the first part of an ebook, on the cultural dimensions of Ukrainian Jewish relations. So those are resources. And then there's, I've given you this Jewish Galicia and Bukovina. These guys, this is Hebrew University in Jerusalem, they've put together an atlas of Jews in Galicia and Bukovina. It's not up yet. It's going to be an online resource that covers everything you could imagine, from earliest settlements until the Holocaust, through the Holocaust. So it's not out yet, but it's going to be out. And then I don't know if Jewish Gen, or Gen, I don't know how they say it, Jewish Gen, probably from genealogy. Yizkor book translations. So those are, if you go, for instance, you want to see what happened into, let's say, Terabovia in Ukraine. There'll be, you put the name in, a book will come up, translated into English from the Yiddish, which will tell you about the Jews of Terabovia, or, and their history. So I use that a lot, especially for some of my research. And then some of my relevant publications, but the only thing I'll mention is that there's the Ukrainians, Jews, and the Holocaust Divergent Memories will be available to be purchased. The little black book, right?